What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. We'd also like to give a special shout out to one of Not Your Average Meta's generous patrons, Martin Stanley, for everything he's done to help out the channel. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we're bringing you a super fun back and forth game of Commander featuring a couple new commanders to the channel. This week's matchup features Martin returning playing his new Lord of the Rings Scribe Matters commander Arwen Undomiel, Patrick back again trying to make his Scarab God deck work properly for the channel, Fallgirl playing his new vampire deck being led by Licia, Sanguine Tribune, and Foil playing the almost too strong for casual Light-Paws Emperor's Voice. Now that we're fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Patrick plays a tapped Steam Vince, while Fog plays a Plains and Foil plays a Plains of his own. Martin plays an island and passes to Patrick, who plays a mountain and then pays 1 to suspend an Ancestral Vision. Fog plays a Swamp and then pays 2 for an Arcane Signet, while Foil plays another Plains and then casts a Transcendent Envoy. Martin plays a Force for turn and then pays 2 to cast his commander Uncommon Arwen. On his upkeep, Patrick removes a time counter from his Ancestral Vision and draws for turn before playing an island and passing. Fog plays a second Swamp for turn before he then pays 3 and casts a Bontu's Monument. Foil plays a Plains for turn, and then pays 2 to cast his commander Light-Paws. He then pays 1 in order to cast a Spectral Steel, enchanting his commander, which allows him to go get an Angelic Gift from his library, which he also uses to enchant his commander. He then draws off the Aura and passes his turn to Martin and plays a Flooded Grove, before then paying 3 in order to cast a Chrome Cat. He then chooses to put a 1/1 counter on his commander before he then scries 1 card, putting it on the bottom of his library. Martin then goes to combat swinging at Patrick for 3 commander damage. On his upkeep, Patrick removes another time counter from his Ancestral Vision and then draws for turn. He then plays a Reliquary, towers his land for turn. Fog then pays to cast a Night's Whisper, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 life, before paying 2 to cast a discounted Markov Baron. Fog then casts a Null Priest of Oblivion. Foil plays another Plains for turn and then enchants his Envoy with On Sarah's Wings. This then triggers his commander, which has him going into his library and getting a Daybreak Coronet, enchanting his commander. Foil then counts up his commander's power before swinging 2 damage over at Martin while he swings 6 commander damage over at Fog. Foil then gains 6 life from the lifelink and passes his turn to Martin, who draws for turn and plays another island. Martin then taps out and casts all-around Master of Healing before passing his turn over to Patrick. Patrick removes another counter off the Ancestral Vision and draws for turn before playing a tapped Izzet Guildgate. Fog draws and plays a Glass Case Heart for turn before going to combat swinging his vampire over at Patrick for 2 damage, which has him gain 2 life, and creating a blood token from his artifact. Foil draws and then enchants his commander with a Sage's Reverie. He then stacks the triggers in order to go into his library and get an Armored Ascension, enchanting his commander, before he then draws 6 cards off the Reverie. He then plays a land for turn and casts a Flump before going to combat, this time swinging 2 damage at Fog and his commander over at Martin. Martin then takes 18 commander damage while Foil gains 18 life and he passes turn. Martin draws for turn and then just pays 2 in order to cast a Riddle Form. On his upkeep, Patrick's Ancestral Vision finally goes off, which has him drawing 3 cards before he then draws another card for turn. He then plays his Tectonic Edge for turn and casts a Nivix Guildmage, and on his end step, Fog pays 1 life and uses his artifact to create a 1/1 vampire token. Fog draws for turn and then casts an Elixir of Immortality before he then goes to combat swinging 2 of his vampires over at Foil. Foil decides to not block, which has Fog gaining 5 life, and during his second main phase, this gives him enough life gain this turn in order to just pay 3 to cast his commander Licia. Foil plays another Plains for turn before casting a Pariah, enchanting his commander. This then has him going into his library to get a Battle Mastery, which he also uses to enchant his commander. But before Foil can go to combat, Martin casts a Heathian Knots in order to tap down Light-Paws and add a counter to his commander, before he then scries a card to the bottom of his library and draws. Foil then casts a Thalia Heretic Cathar, and in response, Fog pays another life in order to use his artifact and create another vampire token. Martin draws for turn and then pays 1 to cast a really fancy Soul Ring, before he then pays 5 and casts a Song of Earendel. This then has him adding 2 counters to his commander before he then scries 2 before drawing them. Martin then plays an island as his land for turn before going to combat, swinging 3 of his creatures over at Foil. Foil decides to block the riddle form with his flump, and in response, Martin casts Lost in the Labyrinth in order to give his creature -3/-0 and scry 1, pumping up the rest of his creatures. Martin then scries his one card to the bottom of his library, and we all remember that all damage dealt to Foil is dealt to his commander, and Martin basically wasted his attack step. Patrick draws for turn and plays a tapped Highland Lake before paying 2 in order to cast a Smuggler's Copter. Fogg draws and then casts a Sanguine Bond, vowing to do whatever it takes to take Foil out of the game this turn. He then pays 5 life to put 3 counters on his commander before going to combat and swinging all out at Foil for 17 damage. Foil then blocks Fogg's commander with Flump, which has Foil and Patrick each drawing a card, while Fogg gains 17 life, which then triggers the Sanguine Bond, which uses to have Foil lose 17 life. Foil plays a Plains for turn and then casts an Oromancer, which has him returning his dub from his graveyard back to his hand. Foil then pays to cast the dub enchanting his commander, which has him going into his library to get an Unquestioned Authority, which he also uses to enchant his commander. Foil then goes to combat and does the honorable not your average meta thing and rolls a dice to see who he's going to kill with commander damage. The Lords of Chaos then choose Patrick, and in response to attacks, Patrick pays 4 in order to cast an Aetherize, which bounces Light-Paws back to Foil's hand and definitely saves the table from certain death. Foil then casts a Cursed Totem and passes to Martin, who draws for turn. Martin then remembers to uptick his Saga, which has him creating a 2/2 bird token and a treasure token. Martin then pays to cast a tapped Kinesos Priest of Thassa, a Chance Met Elves, and a Nimrodal Watcher. Martin then goes to combat and swings 2 of his creatures over at Foil once again. Foil then decides to block the non-commander creature with Flump, which has him taking 7 commander damage, before he chooses himself and Martin to each draw a card. Patrick draws for turn and then pays 6 to cast his commander, the Locust God. Fogg draws for turn and then pays to cast a Star in the Decadent, dealing a damage to each of his opponents and gaining a life. Fogg then once again goes to combat, swinging all out at Foil, who blocks 3 of his creatures, but still has Fogg gaining 17 life and shooting him for 17 damage. Fogg then goes to his end step, gaining 17 more life from a Star in and shooting Patrick for 17 damage off Sanguine Bond. Foil draws for turn and then pays to recast his commander, Light-Paws. He then gives her a good luck pat and enchants her with a Holy Strength, before going into his library to get a Hyena Umbra, enchanting her. Finally, he pays 1 to cast an Alicid of Life's Bounty and passes turn. Martin draws for turn and then triggers the last stage of his saga, which has him putting a flying counter on his commander. Martin then pays 1 and casts an Op, which has him putting counters on a lot of his creatures, before he then scries a card to the bottom of his library before drawing. Martin then pays to cast an Elven Farsight, which has him putting even more counters on his commander, along with putting counters on 2 of his other creatures, before he then scries 3 cards. He then puts the cards back and reveals the top card of his library, which is a creature, which has him drawing it. Martin then goes to combat and decides to swing a majority of his creatures over at Fogg, who decides not to block and gets taken down to 54 life, while he also swings 1 creature over at Foil, taking him down to 9 life. Martin then casts a Windrider Patrol, scrying 2 and passing turn. Patrick draws and creates a tapped insect before tapping out in order to cast a Jaya's Immolating Inferno. He then uses his 3 targets to take out 3 of Fogg's vampires, ensuring that the table doesn't die on Fogg's next turn. He then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Fogg for 4 damage in the air. Fogg draws for turn and then casts Anji, Maid of Dishonor, draining the table for another life and creating another blood token. He then also casts Varric Warp Singer, draining the table for an additional life, before he then goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Martin, showing no fear. Martin then blocks with his cat, and Fogg still gains 7 life, shooting Patrick for 7 life off the Sanguine Bond trigger. Foil plays a Plains for turn before he then casts an Indestructibility, enchanting his commander, which has him going into his library in order to go get an Angelic Destiny, which he also uses to enchant his commander. He then pays 2 in order to exile the Spectral Steel from his graveyard and bring the Daybreak Coronet back to his hand. Foil then recasts a Daybreak Coronet, enchanting his commander, which has him going into his library to get an Ethereal Armor, which he enchants his commander with. Foil then counts up all the commander damage he can do before it goes to combat, swinging his commander over at Fogg, taking him out of the game with commander damage while he gains 19 life. Martin draws for turn and then pays 5 to cast Horses of the Bruinen, which has him attempting to bounce 2 of Foil's creatures back to his hand. and in response, Foil pays to sack his creature and give his commander hexproof. Distillous Thalia getting bounced back to Foil's hand and Martin getting tempted by the ring before he then scries 2 cards, keeping them on top of his library, and he adds more counters to all of his creatures. Martin then goes to combat and has enough damage on board to swing creatures at both Foil and Patrick, which has both of them losing the combat damage and Martin winning the game. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.